Chers collègues, dear colleagues, egregie colleghi, cominciamo. Rebonjour à tous, j'espère que...
So good morning, everyone. Once again, I hope you have liked the lunch, although it was quite short. We are now resuming today's works for the second session. I'm going to introduce you Mr. Mumembele, professor at Kinshasa University. I don't want to talk about his biography. As I know you have already been provided with their biography. Therefore, I would like to focus on three items. He has worked on cultural heritage, and today is going to focus on museums management in African areas at academic level. Therefore, in Kinshasa, he's also curator of museums. He has also managed the National But what is really interesting is the way he tried to professionalize the practices of his collaborators who worked in Congo-based museums. It is difficult to introduce and tell you everything about his biography, but I think this is enough to tell you what a professional we are going to deal with. And I think it is our responsibility and everyone's responsibility to listen to his speech when he talks about Congo-based museums. He worked in Congo when this country was quite alienated, and our colleague is going to talk about the consequences of this fact. It's basically an initiative that launched by the government. As a matter of fact, the former Secretary of State decided that 1/3 of the cultural heritage had to be allocated for the royal palace. So it was a marketing issue he had to deal with. He had decided that 1/3 of this heritage had to be given back to Congo, and those working to trace the origin of these elements now focus on the analysis of several collections. And I think this could be seen as a problem, but I would also like to focus on the role of professionals working in Belgian museums, also to try and revise our approaches, focusing on repatriation, because besides and regardless of our colonialist heritage, Montbellier reminds us that we do not own the assets. We have the task to protect them. We cannot decide if a collection can be placed somewhere. Or so I would leave him the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Je voudrais remercier
So thank you. I would like to thank ICOM for inviting us to join this meeting. So thank you, ICOM Europe and Africa. Jean-Paul, I would like to thank you for this invite. And I would also like to thank all the colleagues that have preceded me today and that have so far presented an element that affects all of us. My intervention is going to focus on what you see on the slide. I would like to talk starting from what we saw earlier today. That was quite interesting. I would like to continue the discussion by focusing on the dialogue between the international expertise and the professionals of museums. This meeting is to be or has been organized to understand what we have to look at and how we have to look at things, because the commitment to give value to our heritage has to be as effective as possible. And for this reason, I would like to talk about African Museum, focusing on the dialogue between international experts and professionals working in the museums of the South and North Africa. So I would like to start by focusing on the South before delving into the North. And this presentation has three main aspects I'm going to focus on. So first, I would give you some inputs on the context of our reflection. The second aspect concerns Africa and its museums. So earlier today we spoke about Africa and its museums. Africa is not one single country, but there are things that belong to the African museums, and we have to understand what has changed in terms of museums so far. And the third aspect, it wants to be a little bit wants to provoke you, because we have to decolonize museums to facilitate dialogue between professionals, between the professionals working in museums in the north and south of Italy. So how we can, how you can see, as you can see, the role of museums in Africa and the presence of African objects in Western museums has been very interesting so far. It has raised interests as well as issues. And some of these issues are discussed on a daily basis. That, and it's a subject that is quite interesting. And for this reason, I would like to focus on how and why the African objects that have reached Europe and therefore come from different cultures are located in a land that does not belong to them. So I'm curious about the context, that the background. So these questions remain at the core of our analysis. The presence of works of African works of art and African objects in Europe is an issue because most of these objects are very old. So maybe in some cases they have reached Italy due to wars and violence, as we heard earlier today with our colleagues. So maybe they were the result of punitive expeditions to demonstrate the success of a party over another. But beyond that, these objects have reached Europe as gifts from local authorities for the different reasons. For example, if we look at Belgium and Congo, some local authorities have decided to give presents to the colonial authorities in order to protect them. It's sort of an exchange to avoid forced labor. Some others were exported to Europe following specific financial transactions. So these objects were arrived here due to illicit transits and illicit trade. But generally speaking, the number of objects, many of these objects do represent the violence of soldiers over local people. For what concerns Congo, we have the Uzinga, the traditional head of state, that was the head of a specific expedition. And on December 1994, and the traditional head was killed during the fight, and after the murder, General Storms reacted to the beheading of the head of state. After this event, General Storms decided to collect traditional objects to Belgium and bring them to Belgium. If we analyze the possession of these goods, we can understand that this fact could be considered as an epistemicide, so the reflection of an unequal context that created a disparity between Africa and Europe, and whose effects still affect our current behavior. Our museums in Europe and in Africa are the actors of these events because museums host these objects. They protect them regardless of their provenance, origin. So we have to act. We have to commit to achieve a fruitful collaboration between the cultural institutions of African Europe and a collaboration between African museums and local communities. And in addition to that, which should analyze the collection of material, of these materials, these objects. And these reflections should be carried out hand in hand with European and international institutions.
Ces interrogations vont se faire ensemble avec des communautés sources, productrices et détentrices
And the activity
de
should
ces
also
documents.
involve
C'est dans ce contexte que
original
se crée en quelque sorte
communities.
la POD.
So in this
Et
context,
réponse, le modèle de
we
partage
can achieve
et
our
collaboration
objective.
entre les différentes
Therefore, the
communautés
redesigning of partnership
à
methodology
toutes ces problématiques
methodologies. And it is
liées
vital
aux collections africaines qui se trouvent
to
actuellement
do so
en Europe.
when dealing
Il faut quand
with
même nous interroger. Mais il faut un certain nombre
African
de
collections in
conditionnements de part et d'autre. Il faut un certain nombre
Europe.
d'attitudes
But in
que
order to
nous
do
devons
so,
avoir.
we
Et
have
je
to
pense
analyze
que
behaviors.
ces conditionnements, ces attitudes se basent sur le respect mutuel et la collaboration entre les différents acteurs. Ce qui nous amène à nous poser quelques questions
This brings us
par rapport à ce
to
partenariat équitable. Il s'agit entre autres d'une
understand
collaboration et
the role of equal and fair partnership. So we have to understand what kind of collaboration can exist between the professionals of museums in Europe and Africa. So when dealing with these situations, we have to understand what kind of partnership we would like to create.
entre les acteurs, entre les musées africains et le
But
musée
the most important thing should be the fair partnership between African and
le soutien, parce que nous parlons du dialogue, nous parlons du
European
dialogue.
museums. The second question is what kind of partnerships and supports can we provide to the European museums when it comes to protection of the heritage? Additionally, when dealing with the restitution of the cultural heritage and the repatriation and their repatriation, which is important, we need to know if human remains are present, because in some European museums we have African remains, and this is an ethical problem because the presence of human remains
dans des conditions limitées humaines. Et la dernière question,
cannot guarantee human dignity if they are placed in paper card boxes.
quelle est la place des communautés locales?
Then, what's the role of local communities?
Parce qu'il y a également une présence très importante de la diaspora africaine internationale en Europe.
We know that the African diaspora is present in Europe, so we might also understand what is the role of these communities in this new perspective of partnership.
Des relatifs et de ces musées
Talking
il convient
about
de
Africa and these museums, it is vital to highlight that museums in Africa
considérer comme instrument d'aliénation
have been considered as a tool
véhicule
for colonial domination. They share the history from a Western perspective. Therefore,
véhicule qui donne l'idée, la perception de l'Occident,
these instruments should
l'histoire et
give the input of the European and the effect of the European culture on the African population. So
Ce n'est pas une muséographie au départ conçue par les Africains et pour les
the
Africains.
misography is not
Une muséographie construite
focused on
par
Africans.
les Européens
It's something done by Europeans for Europeans. And in Congo, for instance, among the instructions given to the colonial curators, we have the visit to the museum. And upon visiting them, they understand what kind of population they're dealing with, their potential, their economic and politic potential. And with this in mind, it is important for the African professionals to reflect on their role, because African institutions have failed to protect their heritage and have failed to properly present them. So at a certain point, with the International Council of Museums, à Bamako, on a the most important meeting was organized. This meeting had a title, What Kind of Museums for Africa? And this meeting enabled people to wonder about the need for museums in Africa and the kind of museums to have there. And Alfo Marconare questioned the presence of museums. So this international meeting at an African level allowed the localization of museums in Africa and the definition of the future. So this already represents a form of decolonization. 3 decades later, local communities have been faced with new challenges. Challenges that are linked to conservation, lack of masterpiece, and here I would like to go back to the declarations by Godonu and statements by Godonu, who confirmed that more than 90% of African cultural heritage is located out of the African borders. So everything is located outside. And equally, the other issue, the other challenge concerns the illicit trafficking of cultural heritage. And we have realized that the illicit trafficking of cultural heritage is still there and is one of the main issues. So another important element concerns the religious extremisms that has become one of the greatest issues we have to deal with in terms of African cultural heritage. cultural objects have become objects belonging to the paganism. And therefore, Africans, with their Bibles in their hands, want these objects to be burned. It's also due to the Pentecostalism and religion has also become an issue for the decision of the future of these objects. Many of these objects have been blamed for their Satan-related meaning. And this goes hand in hand with the lack of financing and the lack of visibility, as many museums in Africa have no funds. And how Gael was saying, when we talk about Africa, we have to deal with the realities of each country and each region. And I think the example of Benin earlier today gives you an idea of the importance of the public commitment to achieve and build important museums. And it's an example we have to welcome. But unfortunately, as I was saying, there is too little communication to bring these examples elsewhere. We would have loved to have similar actions in other countries, in other nations in Africa, and this could benefit the reputation of museums everywhere in Africa. But the fact that rural population is considered as the main producer of cultural objects is linked to their failure to access museums, mainly for political reasons. And consequently, rural population seem to be left out of this heritage, which is valorized. So, what we need to know is that African collections in national museums are not well known, and in many cases we have many beautiful rooms, but these rooms are not well kept, are not well maintained. And therefore, we have to guarantee an open dialogue between local communities and museum professionals. So museums should not be considered as political tools, but they have to be used to foster and enhance the culture of each single nation. So how can we create and conceive a dialogue in such a context? As we also have to ensure dialogue between the local communities and the African institutions. So this brings us to the third aspect, so the decolonization as a tool to foster dialogue between professionals and the professionals of northern and southern museums. So the first tool is the dialogue between these two actors that have different ideas. It's a complex process, of course. Why so? Because it implies the commitment of all the parties involved, which will have to rethink the story and the narration of the museum. And this is one of the main steps of the decolonization. And it goes hand in hand with the restitution of the cultural heritage. This restitution is a fundamental step that could give the possibility of recreating models. And in my opinion, this is vital. We should focus on this aspect. As Jean-Paul already said yesterday, the cultural restitution is not a news. It has nothing to do with Macron. We spoke about it in the 70s when speeches focused on this aspect, even at the UN level. So speeches focused on the restitution of cultural heritage, and we should never forget the important contribution of the former head of UNESCO. He requested the repatriation of many cultural assets. So restitution is a legitimate process. And it's legitimate because these objects represent an identity. And when we give them back, we give them the possibility to get back into their original framework. And this enables the African people to reconcile with its own history. And giving cultural heritage back to the Africans enable Africans to gain dignity, because these objects were collected in a very violent environment. And when giving them back, we give dignity back to Africans. But this would also look at the new generations, which could finally be given the objects that belong to their history. Probably in the past, people would say that for a young African man to see, it was impossible for a young African man to actually see goods, objects, and works of art by African artists. Why so? Because these are located elsewhere, and in some cases it is very difficult for Africans to get to Europe. And therefore, as ICOM, as ICOM, we have to ensure mobility for researchers, because many professionals and many researchers have no possibility to move in many circumstances because of rules that prevent them from accessing Europe. And as we all know, European museums do own objects that were collected through violence. There are many countries who are trying to approve law on restitution, but we have seen that these laws are merely political. The actors participating in the actual implementation of these laws are political actors. Alain had the chance to change things because of his role, but in Belgium and in France, for instance, things are different because museum professionals are not involved in these processes. And for what concerns the restitution, the contribution of professionals is vital. Therefore, it is important to cooperate. Some museums look for projects and a research project that need to be strengthened. Dialogue between the professionals from northern Europe and the global north and the global south should guarantee inclusion to all people, even marginalized ones. And too often, when we talk about dialogue among cultural stakeholders, we think that only European museums can acquire African objects to exhibit, but also African museums can now welcome European remains. So why should we focus our analysis only on the European side? Because if these objects are universal and they can be accessed by everyone, why should we focus our attention on Africa in Europe only? And why do we fail to organize exhibitions on Europe in Africa? Think about Leonardo, Picasso's works of art that remain in Europe and never get to Africa to be seen by young Africans who wish to see them. Therefore, it is crucial to rethink the way we present things. It's not a one-way approach. Cultural objects should circulate across the world. So this is why a dialogue should be guaranteed among professionals. And this is why the dialogue should also include the possibility of welcoming European objects. Dear colleagues, the dialogue we wish to start should be based on the mutual respect of our values in order to develop a much better balanced, very well balanced dialogue. And it should be based on mutual listening of the other party. But for a fruitful dialogue, we need to respect values and stick to important values. So how can we have important relationships and fruitful dialogues if we are already aware of the fact that human remains are saved and stocked in museums, in boxes? It's unthinkable. We all know that we all share the same values. We have ethical and human values. And we need these values to be shared by all the actors and all the museums involved. How can we start a balanced and fair dialogue? How can we fairly exchange information if we know that human remains of people coming from Africa are stocked in boxes as regular museum objects? Cultural objects have uh, have different values. They are not as important as human beings. So this is a request. We would like museums who own human remains to give them back to their original countries, because in many cases they have been identified, and if they have been identified, they should be given back to the original families in order for them to be properly buried. Another problem I would like to insist on concerns the additional effort required to fight against the illicit trafficking of cultural heritage, which still represents a problem in sub-Saharan Africa. It's a story that has been going on for 3 decades. We have ongoing wars, and we always talk about the exploitment of natural resources, but we always fail to talk about the dramatic consequences at a cultural level. Many objects are seized. And so far, no statements have been made, no declarations have been signed. This should be solved through dialogue and collaboration. We should all look at the same direction, look towards the same direction, so as to protect cultural heritage in war zones. And in order for institutions to start protecting cultural heritage where these remains are faced with this situation, we have to encourage our museums and our European colleagues to support African museums, especially in terms of digitization of the heritage, the digitization of the cultural heritage, which could represent a solution to protect our heritage. We also hope to receive funding for the training of professionals dealing with protection of assets. It is vital to underline that one of the main aspects of the concerning the protection of our cultural heritage is the protection of the intangible asset. The intangible heritage is fundamental for Africa, and it is about to disappear. Why so? Because we spend a lot on tangible heritage. But in my opinion, digitization could also help us create bridge between the different actors. So, dear colleagues, it is important for us all to take actions. Actors, professionals working in museums in the global north and the global south, because only together can we achieve the protection of what can be saved. Protection of the cultural heritage should not be considered as a final goal. Instead, it should be considered as a process, and restitution should be considered as a process enabling us to work together, to continue working together in order to properly have responsibilities for the future. Thank you.
Bonjour, chers collègues. Je suis très heureuse.
Good morning, dear colleagues. I'm very happy to be here and to introduce some speeches. There are some words very interesting that has been said. Daniele Yala has been known from many of you. He is an historian with important role at an official level in the direction of Piemonte region, director of the Museum of Torino. He taught museology and history and cultural heritage in different Italian universities. He has been president of ICOM Italy, and he is chairman of the National Museum of Resistance in Turin. It's not national, of the Museum of Resistance. And he also works for the cultural heritage for a new idea of the National Museum. And he also worked for research projects. He also published different works in this sector in journals and works starting by 1994. He worked focusing on history and also focusing in a rich scientific path. He published different texts about this subject, freedom and war. And he also worked as a freelance, as a co-commissioner in the design program in Valle d'Aosta. With Giancarlo La Serenza, he was also commissioner of the exhibition of the initial program of the National Museum of the Shoah. And he also been the curator of an open-air museum from 2020 with our president of the journal, of the international journal. So I would like to remind you and all the goals to underline the richness of the path of Daniele Yala. So we are very happy that he proposed to open this session because we are very interested in this subject. I'm very happy of the speech he will give concerning the spirit of the museum. We can count on your original and provocatory thought in order to ask some important questions. You are the right person to talk about this matter, because I remember when in 2020 we were in Paris and you gave a very important speech concerning the new definition of museum that keeps making us nervous and arises questions and reflections. What is a museum? How can we define a museum? I think that we have not ended the reflection. The museum is a place of negotiation of meanings, and I think that is important to remember this. Every negotiation has as a consequence the fact of listening and dialogue, and this is a complex mission. And I would like to underline that today by mentioning also Vespasiano, for example. Maybe you could give an introduction about that. The spirit of the museum is a great matter as a base for Europe and African dialogue. Thank you.
Qu'est-ce qui est arrivé que je cherchais une
I would like to talk about the spirit of the law, and at the end, I decided to go into details by analyzing the factors and the monuments of which you can admire the remains. Recently, they allowed us to look at some historical finds, and it allowed us to have like a mirror of the empire. And it is slightly different because it is a temple that defined today's museum. Up to 20 or 30 years ago, we had Joseph Prokop, and they have been destroyed completely. The remains that represented a small part, but they allowed us to define the identity. And according to the archaeologists, the archaeologists attribute a specific nature on the remains. So we have to think about what the exhibition represented, what the exhibition of Museum of Ferrara represented. Because Joseph, after celebrating his victory and after the Roman Empire, Vespasiano decided to build a peace temple in a great manner. It has been built between 65 and 68, and it represents the main route of that time. You said, Luigi, that it is one of the main route of that time. It was not a traditional time we are talking about, but it was a monumental complex that involved a square with arcades with holes. And the square was occupied by a monumental complex with a part with different trees and plants, within which we could see a temple of peace. Let's continue with Joseph by saying that he dedicated his lucky in order to work. And we also have other works represented by the writings, the works of art. Humankind had to go across the world in order to go to some countries to preserve the objects. So at the time, they ordered that the sanctuaries were preserved, but some of them have been destroyed later, and a library has been set up, and also a work office has been set up where the Urbis form has been exhibited. It was a great representation of the life of Rome, and it was in marble. And we saw the map of the Arapachis that was a material and tangible map. And it remains like this up to the use and the exploitation of lands for the cultivation. So if you know Viale dell'Impero of Mussolini, it's still there. So what is the comparison we can do? It is a forum, that is to say a place where we cannot do any negotiation. As in the Roman fora, it is a matter of civil issues. It is a site dedicated to think. It is a separated place without any trade and separated from the urban context, and with walls where we could find only the works of art coming from Nerone and coming from the wars. It was a war, a Jewish war, a rebellion within a colony. It is a commemorative monument that celebrates the victory of the emperor of the time, that has the value of being referred to the peace. So it had some important elements necessary in order to be an emperor. And at the same time, it was the one who won the Roman Civil War. So the transport of the works of art is a way of creating a damnatio memoriae. It is an exaggeration, of course, but he builds on the Domus Area land an amphitheater, the Colosseum. What is the Colosseum? An amphitheater built as a former manubis built by the slaves, the Jewish slave that have been traded to Rome. And that area was the appropriation of the works of art that was public, Greece and Roman. We have to remember that these are two documents that are present in the World Heritage Site. And if you noticed it, it is not all written in the books we studied. But I think that it's good to remember all that, since the Colosseum became a symbol of Rome in Italy. And we celebrate it as an extraordinary architecture, but it involves in itself the horrible aspect, a monument dedicated to slavery and to rebellion. We could be happy. Could we be happy about that? It's like a museum. And I would like to ask the same question that was asked already concerning the Roman temples that were the exhibition places of the public collections. This chapter was really interesting since we saw an analysis of Roman collectors, a private Roman collector, but also from a public Roman collector. I remember in a Roman, there was the Catium Pratim, a right that allowed to speak and to do something in order to avoid to touch the works of art. So it was a very public vision of the collection. But from a general point of view, it's a collection that is oriented towards the eternity. But our collections are oriented towards a future history. We are talking about works of art, a collection of works of art with a holy goal. We can enable it to the museologists or museums, but what can we do? We can use some contemporary categories and use them in different contexts where the object we are talking about does not exist. For example, that is what happens, and we should act, first of all, in all the museum books or history books, starting with the Alessandrini museums. It's a library that only had the name of the museum, but the name is not the object. One of the chapter of Christophe Demien I'm going to read just some sentences. The commissioner sent abroad in Greece, and the civil in the board committee were between the first to collectionate. I know it's weird, dear African colleagues. The Roman Empire was present before the other empires, and the wars and many wars occurred. And an important part of the wars were the consequences of the war. We have to remember that Nerone is a collector, imperial collector. And we have to remember that these collections foresaw also the looting of the Roman temple. And the third remark is that Christoph did not have the documents we have today, so he briefly talked about that. But there was nothing to demonstrate that these works of art were of an iconographic interest. So we use this example in order to talk about the concept of museum and to look at the similarities. And I would like to do that by starting with different words: power, knowledge, society, collection, ownership, materiality, and non-materiality, and power. The temple is a royal monument of the royal power. But it is a collection that has been shared with the modern temple. Some years ago, I think about Gael, they talked a lot about the power. But the heritage of the first generation of museum consists on the publishing of dynasty books and collections that concerned the power, and that showed the information and the history to the public concerning the oppression and the war and the slavery conditions. So if we think about the wars of the 70s, we can see this war that is important because we saw already these subjects in different history books, and that matters are always present in our conversations. So, concerning the first question is that of remembering that museums are considered as a class power. They were not able to find another definition, but they are considered as a class power that are useful to spread information and where we can impose a conception of a heritage and culture that belongs to the classical world and to people. It is not. So I would like to talk during this conversation about museum. I would like to remind you that every museum has a power of willingness and of knowledging. Because we have, in order to have power, we have to have knowledges. Empowered with dialogue, an independent power. The Temple of Peace is extraordinary. The architect made an important work with their engagement. There were 3 of them. They also studied the architecture of the structure. And when we talk about the marbles that have to be fined, I'm talking about the most important men in the empire. And when we talk about plants, what did they do? I understood that. I think in that case we have to think about the botanical garden. In order to put this at the center of the empire. Above all, I think that we should all think, and I also think that we all know the contemporary situations and the complexity of the economy in the museums. Sometimes we are talking about power issues. There are some architects within this democracy or society. We are now working and we are now serving the society. But what society we are considering? There is no society as a unity, as an organic unity. It is divided into lands, territories, and groups. And by starting on what I'm going to say is that if society or the museum have been present, they have always represented society. I was inspired by the teaching of Dominique, and he inspired me a lot, and he wrote that the justification of the museum depends on the legitimacy of its legal framework and its public success. I also would like to give you another element before this quote, the historical identities. This determination of the museums in comparison to the knowledge, to the power, it has particular position. We spent it from the last collection in the last decades to another type of collections, starting also from the UNESCO World Heritage Site. But museums is a tool in order to create a democracy in every country. And this shift was not realized in some neighborhood countries. The tool of cultural democracy in 1972 was important. There also was a file, a document in the journal I work on with Julienne. The paternalistic function was mentioned, and in each case was superior on the museum, and it has not changed. The only step forward concerns a chance that I don't know if it will have positive results. We have to remember that what has changed in the last years. There are more people. The society changed. In Italy, we are not able to have the 30% of adults. And many people tell us that many people that went to museum are not enough. Castles, botanical gardens. So in Italy, the data tell us that one person visited only one museum per year. Maybe museums are something for rich people, but let's talk about society. 93% of the population with a low income haven't ever gone to a museum. Sorry, 83%. It is a cultural diversity. There is an invisible border that cuts horizontally the society. And every type of inclusion is an attempt of changing the situation, an hegemony. It is a complex shift. Let's talk about the collection that is a central point. Before a museum, the collection was already there, and the collection is an assembly of material objects and movable objects, and this is the characteristic of the European collection. I don't know, I won't go into details. So concerning the concept, we saw that in a classic study concerning the European possessive individualism, we saw it as an element that characterized Europe starting by the 17th century. And Clifford wonders, concerning the last point, the practice of this grouping, and so this assembly of these movable and tangible goods in a universal sector. We have not an answer to that, but Clifford thinks that there's no universal answers and concepts. Since collections has as a consequence the accumulation of objects considered like richness of skills and memories. Clifford does not have a vision of a large area and time. But there is another text and document of Pierce that says that even that these behavior is typical the European culture, that is the exchange, the accumulation of objects are typical of the European cultures, and it is a way of creating relationships between the populations, between people. So ownership, materiality of the collection. I talked with Juliette some years ago concerning the acquisition process. A museum acquires a collection, and it is more elegant, I will say, and it acquires the ownership. No, there is no museum that works with an object which it has not the ownership. And this is a shift that can be found clearly. It's like a legacy of a museum to the collector. But we are not public collector with the typical and normal private behavior of a private collector. So our behavior in the market is different when we want to acquire an object. Our pleasure to add it in our collection and be the owner of it. And this is an element of a contemporary and modern museum. I don't know if it's also from a global point of view, but I'm sure it is also by an European global view. And it is difficult to go from the concept of ownership to that of responsibility. Concerning the example of the Museum of Montreal, that involves in the storage all the objects he entered in contact with, and also concerning the reliability of the museum. So there is a gap from ownership and responsibility. And this is the answer to the predatory museums, the museums that concentrate on the ownership and the possession. And with this approach, I would like to add also the collections created between 19th century and forward, as, for example, the ethnographic museums. The behavior of experts or the mentality of the population is the same that they had towards the population of other countries, all indigenous. And the museums are ethnographic and anthropological at the same time. The people's spirit can be compared to other kinds of spirits. And I think that this is a situation that lasts until the 16 years, when another approach arose. Another approach started growing by creating ethnographical museums created by the generation of the communities that kept working generation after generation, and that did not need labels. Everyone knew what they was because there was a generational turnover. And they entered into contact with local powers in an optimal way that transformed them in touristic tool. So in order to conclude, I would like to say, to talk about a text of Daniel Ferre, the desire of persist, if I'm not wrong. What can be considered authentic for our object, for our society? The object that we protect, and so the authenticity is in the material itself, maybe. There are two ways of seeing this story. The object, that is the object, the cultural heritage, or the object with an intangible value, because it is a memory and it has an emotional value. It is a cultural heritage, so it is always the same concept. If this watch, for example, for me, it has an emotional value, so societies do not consider this object authentic. I remember, for example, when that in Asia they were surprised of seeing the temple because it was built with ancient techniques. The authenticity is not in the object, but in the culture, in the gesture, and not in the object itself. We have to pay attention to that. Above all, in the African Museum, where they imitated a model of the society, and these museums preserved the materials and technologies, but we lost the savoir-faire, the know-how. I do not think it was a voluntary action. I know how to wash this shirt, for sure, but by passing the generations, maybe we will change the way we are going to cook. For example, we have not learned to produce food with specific tools. So maybe I'm running a little bit late. Do I have time? Still some minutes? So we also know that our definition of museums suggests us that we preserve the intangible and tangible museum. That's true on the paper. It is written. I trust it. As also the London Museum, where they do extraordinary researches of every art performances. But can we really think that the mental and physical structure of the museum is suitable to preserve a living heritage that lives beyond the museums and that is not mummified? Yes, of course, we can do in the documents. We can enclose it in a museum, but if we want to keep it alive, we cannot do that. And the museum cannot do that. And it is something that the museums lost, because museums, from a pedagogic point of view, and Juliette, you work in a museum like this one, and they taught a job where objects were tools to prepare people to sciences, techniques, and a museum was like a school, thanks to the objects. And today it is a temple for the objects. What is important for us in the Temple of Peace is something that has been transported from the private to the public, and it is useful to represent the victory. So the question is, how many museums have collections of work of art, or maybe they are themselves expressions of this culture of violence. And this is a problem, because I don't know what we could do. But it is important to think about what we can do of this footprint. And this, we have to declare what we have to do, or we tell a lie. But while preparing this speech, I remembered our text of Joseph, a Jewish and Israeli historian, that says maybe the contrary. The oblivion is not the memory, it's just justice, and we can make justice concerning some sins made by our ancestors. So we have to be. Do we have to be sorry for that? The Pope came by saying that he's sorry, and the community said that he should not be sorry to them, but he should be sorry to all the people that have been killed in the past. And it is a complex issue, and I would like tell you some final considerations. Yes, we want.
If we want to look for the museum's spirit, we cannot limit our action to our attention to a small part of the history. But this history, it overlaps a longer history that is the one of the collections. At the beginning, it's connected with the past, with the objects found by the governors, and therefore a collection of tools, particular tools that were stocked as memories. So if I think about the collection, I will think about a physical collection, but Umberto Eco taught us that collections are lists as well. We can start collecting lists, and to make a list, we need to be a society based on writing. But in case of physical collections, we cannot be. We cannot be nomads. My family, my ancestors, for example, had a house, had wardrobes. And since I started talking about writing, this has become the reason why libraries, archives are older. And so with this stability, one of the unbearable elements of the collection becomes the possessive nature of the museum. In conclusion, the European imperialism is not recent. We have the Roman Empire as a reference point that extended well beyond Europe. It had so many provinces. Then we had the Carolingian Empire, the British one. But wait, what happened? After the world wars, the system based on huge empires was dismantled. And we have become the heirs of a national identity. And we forget the past. But in our DNA, we are not heirs of the imperialism. And therefore, with this in mind, with the possessive imperialism, and with this constant need to own cultural heritage, we should change the approach, focusing on the works of art and looking at museums as models. Was it a good idea to take this European model and apply it to other cultures? Well, I think you as colleagues will be able to answer my question, but if we want to be museums working to narrate history and values, if we are, our role is to protect democracy. I would like to conclude by saying that the FAO declaration stems from democracy, in an immaterial and tangible element. And I believe that we should separate from this need for the object in order to better focus on values, any values. This would give us the possibility of emancipate from a subjective imperialism. Thank you.
Should I get started? Are we good? Okay. Buonasera a tutti. So I will start speaking in English, but I might change the language after, during the roundtable to speak actually French. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you to the organizer for doing everything. And we know that it's never an easy job to organize a conference. What will happen is the following. So I will speak for maybe 10 minutes because there is a practical case I would like to present. And then our speakers will join. Didier and Cecilia, where is she? There. They will also present for, let's say, 20 minutes, and then we will have the general discussion with the speakers, the keynote speakers of this afternoon. We think that maybe we could group the question and take them 2 by 2, just not to do one response, and do 2 questions, responses. Let's see how it goes, right? So that's great. You can start the PowerPoint. Yeah. So just I just wanted to share an image of somebody who's in my mind these days, and it's Fatima Falnyang, who's an interesting and important woman in the field of heritage and museum studies and conservation. I also just would like to say that I am a specialist of 18th century France. So a big disclaimer, apologize in advance if I make mistakes or if my knowledge of some topics is not up to date. It's very possible that actually I make mistake. My knowledge of the African continent is very, very, very limited. That being said, I would like just to introduce briefly a case study I've been working on. And I think it touches upon a question we've been discussing all day somehow about how do we talk to each other, how do we translate, how do we conceive heritage and museum. And you can change the slide if you want. Please, am I the one who can do it? No. A lot of my experience was based and forged during a recent conference to which actually Alain was also part of. It was to honor Fatima Fall, who's just retired from Senegal and now who is in Benin. And we were talking about situated knowledge. And I think one of the things we wanted to discuss is that knowledge is situated, and what is a museum is situated, and what is conservation is situated. It's very simple, and it's very basic to say that, but I think it's important just to start the conversation to say that there are different ways in which we can conceive museums. And that doesn't mean we cannot talk to each other. I think we need to talk to each other, but it also means that sometimes we don't have the same ambition or the same understandings, and that's, I guess, quite okay. And in that context, but also before that, we started asking people, okay, what does conservation mean to you? What does heritage mean to you? And we tried to reach a lot of different people, including also these people who do not go to the museum, and these people that are often called communities. And I have to say, I also resisted the word at first when my colleague from Kenya started talking about communities. I was like, what are you talking about? We're all communities, this word I don't like, it's stereotyping. And she really made it clear, no, we use it. It means a certain population, maybe rural population, maybe women, maybe craft people, that you don't get to know or to see every day, and they have a lot of knowledge and they have a lot of expertise. So even if I didn't like the word community, I use it. And I also would like to say that maybe community doesn't translate into communauté. And that's something I'm very, well, it does translate, but it doesn't. What they mean when they use community in Kenya, it took me quite a certain time to understand what they had in mind. And also to accept that some process of talking to each other might also go with some unclarity. We don't understand, we use the same word, we think we know what it means, but actually we're talking about different things. You can go with the who, what? No, you can change the, so one thing that we did, and that's examples here from St. Louis, is going to talk to the craft people, and I have to say also very much so the craft women, because they were in very, very many ways the one who were holding knowledge about what they envisioned as heritage, how they did conservation, what was a museum to them. And we asked a lot of questions, and we recorded also the question we asked and the answers they gave us. And these answers were very interesting for us, and I think it's also a way in which we can collaborate between museums in different continents. For instance, they really put emphasis on natural products for conservation, on plants, on different products that we don't use perhaps in European museum, but they said, actually, we conserve things like that. And sometimes we even ask, but do you know how can you define a museum? How can you define conservation? And they said, well, we are not interested. And I was like, cool, okay, good enough. It's an answer. And that doesn't mean that they don't know what it is, or that doesn't mean that they don't understand what it is, but it means that sometimes they just found this not interesting or not relevant. And I think it was also good to hear, okay, well, you don't care about it. And so we asked, okay, so what do you care about? What would be the words you would be using? And you can change the slide. So we really take this big time to enter a process where we consulted for 2 years. Ah, that's good. We consulted for 2 years. So 2 years, it's a long time, but it doesn't help you to cover all regions, all people, all groups. And we ask the question, okay, what is a museum? What is conservation? But they also say, no, I want to talk about my grandmother. I want to talk about my wedding dress. I want to talk about the tomb of my parents. And this is what I care about. And this is what the conversation should be about. So stop coming and imposing your wording. Let me speak. And also let me speak my language, because we came, and I speak French, so I feel a sense of, oh, it's easy for me. I come to Senegal and I speak to the people. But actually, many people say, first of all, we would like this conversation to happen in Wolof. And second, we will really want to keep the words in their original language. And it was a very interesting thing. I thought I would be able to talk about conservation, talk about museum, talk about heritage, but I had to accept that some words, I didn't know how to translate them. Some realities, I had no idea what they were. They were referring to something, I could not even name it. But what I could do is record their knowledge, pay them for their work. And when I say I, it's not me as a person alone. It's me and a big team of colleagues, including the web designer who's from Kenya, including all my team in Vienna. And we could record this knowledge that is very small, could record also the voices, could record the names, even in languages that I don't speak, such as Fangbe, Yemba, languages that maybe you don't speak neither, actually. And we decided really to work on that level that we can talk to each other, that we have words in common, but that also the realities are not always the same. And that doesn't mean we are different. That means we need to get into a process of translation. And a translation is not from A to B. A translation is a negotiation. It's like a museum. We have to, okay, this is what you mean by community. I mean that. This is what community means politically to me. Okay, to you, it's that. So constantly translating and retranslating the project. So I just wanted to show you that as an introduction, and now I will give the floor. It's a beginning, and you will see we have a lot about Benin, for instance, if you look, because Benin is very good at talking about heritage. They are very present. We don't have anything about France, I think, but it can be done. We can cope with that, because everybody is capable of starting now to contribute. So for Benin, we had a long process with Honoré Tchachouang Ngoupeyu that I'm sure most of you know personally. And he went to collect images with Cristallin Manchot, and they went to collect knowledge, and they discussed, and they proposed the people to collaborate, and they explained them what it would be, and that it would be like a digital museum. And I think today somebody said how important the digital sphere is, and I think we really need to figure that out. In Kenya, the person who designed that, the digital space is one of the most stimulating. I was thinking, wow, but this is just the internet. But perhaps it's just the internet, but nevertheless, it's a thing that is where ideas and knowledge is very strong. And just as a last example to introduce the roundtable, this is an example that many of you know very well. It's called Casse Patrimoniale. So in this case, we use the French words because it's a French Cameroonian project. And it's a collaboration about new model of conservation. a new model of museum. And on the one hand, it really grow on the general knowledge that Chefferie had in a long time about their heritage, because they knew how to preserve it, actually. But it's also a French project, and if you look at who's paying for it, the only sponsors are from France. It's AFD, Agence Française de Développement, and 3 other French sponsors. So I think it also shows how it's complicated. On the one hand, it's a project, also as was said, where Cameroonian expectation and European expectation are negotiated, and there are a sort of museum right there. But on the other hand, there are also a lot of political issue, and who's paying for what, who's building what. I think these are big questions we need to discuss. So that's the introduction I would like to do, and now I will maybe just go to the next slide and introduce Didier, if you want to come. So I will introduce Didier Wenoudet, who's a professor at the University of Abomey-Calavi, and who's also the director in charge of the museum in Dresden, basically, and who's also actually an art historian working on contemporary art. And he will do a brief presentation now. Thank you.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank ICOM for its invite. This conference represents a very important occasion for me. I'm going to immediately start with my presentation. My speech will focus on my experience that I gained last year in Dresden to reconcile museum with its audience and to build a bridge between African and Western German museums. Since we have launched the international collections of Dresden, the question here is, what is our responsibility? We want the museum to become a critical space, and therefore we would like to start a dialogue on the research methodology focused on the concept of community. And this resulted in a conference as well as several roundtables that I'm going to present with this slide. So we have several events that occurred and a set of proposals. For what concerns the inaugural conference, the title was Anamnesis, and the guilt or remorse. So the idea was to start by analyzing the German behavior, and I started from a fundamental paradox. Since Germany has recognized its responsibility with the Shoah, and it has acquired a knowledge of and as it has raised awareness on the importance of remembering, the past becomes part of its activity. And this past, this colonial past of Germany, was marked by a very strong violence with genocides, punitive expeditions in Cameroon, which was, and a genocide in Namibia that was considered as the first genocide ever. So we introduced three main concepts to redesign the German history. The first concept is the anamnesis, therefore, the bringing the need to bring to consciousness what was hidden. It's not just a memory, it's a critical invite to reveal the flaws. Therefore, it's an invite to analyze the violent context that started it. The second topic we worked on was the guilt, as guilt represents a risk, as too often speeches are limited to the guilt at a political level and fail to turn into action. So the objective of guilt is to go beyond that, to share the responsibility. The third point we talked about was remorse. That is useless without any concrete actions. And in the colonial context, we need to put actions, to start with concrete actions that could rebalance the context. So this is a picture taken during the inauguration of the event. And through these speeches, we have demonstrated that we should never limit our activity to the exhibition and storage of objects. Museums instead should be actors of anamnesis, thus creating rooms for dialogues, spaces for dialogues. Because, as we have already said earlier today, colonial objects bring with them a strong violence. The conference also underlined that the colonial history is not, as far as we think, economic imbalance still continues. And therefore, it is important to talk about it in museums. In addition to this inauguration, we organized 3 roundtables, so 3 different debates, during which we had the chance to give the floor to European and African experts. The first roundtable focused on colonialism and responsibility. So Europe should never limit its action to symbolic speeches. Europe should create concrete actions to share responsibility. And the governance of museum should be at the core of the activity. This first roundtable focused on Europe and its responsibility in terms of colonialism. If we talk about German colonialism, we stop at the period before the First World War. But After that period, we went through a very brutal phase. So we had to talk about responsibilities in terms of heritage, culture, and economics. So all the African actors, including Togo representatives, talked about German colonialism, which was the results of which were turned into a cultural center to promote the arts in Togo. And even the National Museum of Cameroon highlights the differences and highlights the fact that heritage should also focus on education and youth. The European responsibility cannot be limited to apologies. It should turn into commitment because it's about recurring facts. So Europe should take this responsibility. Even when talking about museums, we should go beyond self-criticisms to create well-balanced partnerships. It is also important to guarantee integration, inclusion among researchers. It's just a suggestion at a global level, so we need cohesion in production. During this roundtable, we reiterated the colonialist responsibilities as well as the asymmetries and disparities that still persist. European museums actually are the most responsible for colonialisms, and African museums should then focus on the preservation. Europe presents colonialism as a closed chapter that is only in the past. But as we have already said,
et culturelle. Et les musées en sont
colonialism still exists at an economical level, and museums are the expression of it. So, in conclusion, this roundtable demonstrated that it is important to remember and recall the colonialisms and the effect that they have on the present. So, museums should play the role of cultural mediator, and they should also offer a space for active dialogue.
la deuxième table ronde que nous avons.
The second roundtable delved into the research on the origin and the origin of goods coming from a colonial period. The main question was, what is the origin of the tool? And the position of white researchers. So this should be conceived as a political fight against racism. Barnstoff, Brandon, Rewar focused on the importance of fair collaboration and equitable collaboration, pushing research in multiple language. And it is very important to recreate balance in this relationship. For what concerns cross-cutting questions that were asked to all participants, a debate started. Is the provenance a decolonization tool? Does it request a change, a deeper change in culture and museum approach. We reiterated that we cannot accept the research for provenance coming from outside our borders, and therefore we should bear the costs of this research. The third roundtable focused on restitution, which should not be considered as an administrative act, but rather as a complex political, museum, and symbolic gesture. It doesn't mean to send items back. It should be considered as a friendly tool to start a fruitful dialogue. So the objective was to focus on how to obtain how to obtain items, how to request the restitution of goods. And we talked a lot about it, and we concluded that restitution should not be considered as a favor to African countries. It's actually a need, a political need, a political measure. It's a cultural matter. We have talked about violence several times today, and I think some of these remains, some of these goods have been given to colonialists as gifts. So restitution is in order. We have also agreed on a very simple bureaucracy and justice, but we identified three different complexity levels. The first one is legal. We've talked about it when discussing Benin and the restitution of its asset. Then the second level of complexity lies with the political aspects that goes beyond the borders of the museums. To give the heritage back means to overcome difficulties and the difficulties that characterized our past. In some cases, in Germany, for instance, we could be faced with political resistance. Then the third aspect, third level of complexity lies with the logistics. So how we can help African countries to properly preserve the assets and the works of art with no colonialistic approach in mind. One of the main questions during this third roundtable was the following: is restitution a mere transfer of objects, or is it instead a process of reparation and transformation of relationships? It's actually a process of reparation that would give dignity back to the original countries. And with this, we created the basis of the future activity. So we recognized the importance of the basis, and we realized that some people play incorrect roles, and in some circumstances, we had to analyze the database. Finally, we worked on a restitution that had to be considered as an occasion to create a cooperation, a space for cooperation, a space for exchange. This was done to avoid considering it a mere political praxis. in order to highlight and underline the importance of recreating a proper relationship with Africa. So what can we draw from this? For what concerns teachings we can draw from this, we have several aspects to consider. Restitution is ineffective without a change in museums. Secondly, provenance, origin of the asset should not be a mere research. Instead, it should be a learning phase that transforms the relations between Africa and Europe. And thirdly, the importance of museum decolonization, which would be impossible without the social decolonization. And Françoise Vergès reminds us that it's impossible to decolonize museums without a social decolonization first. Therefore, museums should not limit their action to an aesthetic level. In conclusion, let me say that the program we have worked on in Dresden is not the final answer. It wants to create a room, a space for dialogue where artists, militants, researchers, operators will cooperate and share their responsibility in order to transform colonialist traces into into spaces for creation. Thank you.
I'm just going to briefly introduce Cecilia Benaccini, who's professor of cultural anthropology at the University of Torino. And she will also present, among the many things she's done, she will present a case study. I think that was a bit our perspective for the roundtable, a case study in a project that is called Strengthening African-Italian Museum Partnerships. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's not really a research project, it is a cooperation, development cooperation project. First of all, I would like to thank Giuliana Ricani and all the staff for giving me this opportunity. It is a small contribution that I would like to give to the discussion through a very practical and concrete example. The project started a few months ago. And we are at the beginning. So, of course, we listened to many very stimulating suggestions under the theoretical point of view. I would like just to start saying that, of course, African societies have a strong sense of cultural heritage and very efficient, had in the past, very efficient means to transmit their heritage to future generations through oral literature, through rituals, performances, objects. But we know, and it has been already said, that museum is an exogenous notion for African societies. It is a colonial notion. Museum in itself, maybe the only exception I know is Ethiopia, where there was a museum in the 30s, thanks to the will of Emperor Haile Selassie. But apart from this, the museum were introduced in Africa by the colonizers. But this does not mean that African societies are very dynamic, so they adopted this institution and they changed it. And I think we in Europe, we have a lot to learn from the African model of museum that is going on, and especially in the last years, I think that there are notions that we can really try to share. So after independence, museums in Africa were reorganized, and we had many examples today of national African museums that display the diversity of African societies in a sort of unified way. At the same time, a lot of African heritage is in Europe, as we all know, and this, I think, is a major problem for African museums to deal with this heritage, which has been exported in very many different ways, in violent ways, but also in other ways. So, in my view, presently, we really need to work together because the cooperation, it has been said, it's necessary. We need a cooperative and dialogical strategies to promote the sharing of the knowledge, of the African knowledge that come with artifacts, and also to address the problem of illegal acquisition in the present and in the past. So next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So let me tell you very briefly something about this project, Strengthening African-Italian Museum Partnership, SIMP. It is promoted and financed by the Italian Agency for International Cooperation and aims at creating a cooperation network of 4 African museums, 4 national African museums. You can see the National Museum of Ethiopia and the Addis Ababa University Ethnological Museum, the Musée National de Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Ugandan National Museum, together with 4 important Italian museums: Museum of Civilization in Rome, small Museum of Anthropology and Ethnography of the University of Torino that I'm directing, and then the Royal Museums in Torino and the Savoy residences in Piedmont that receive as gift, as diplomatic gift, many, many objects from Africa. The partnership, as you can see, involved also the University of Torino, the University of Milan, the Center for Conservation and Restoration La Venaria Reale, and of course, ICOM, the Italian Agency for Cooperation. I should also say, as you see, this action is somehow part of a bigger European Union action, is a Team Europe initiative that was launched in a meeting in Dakar in 2023, and somebody of you were there, launching a broader Strengthening African-European Museum Partnership. This project is going to begin in the next few months. It has a big finance support, so the cooperation will be hopefully concrete. Next. So I just put some postcards of the museums involved in our Italian project, the Royal Museums in Torino, the Savoy Residence, and the Museum of Civilization, Uganda Museum, Musée National de Lubumbashi, and National Museum of Ethiopia. Next. And 2 universities museums. I would like to underline the university museum are special categories of museum for me because we work with students. We are engaged in education, training. So we have the Museum of Anthropology of the University of Torino and Addis Ababa University Ethnological Museum, which is host in an historical palace, the Geneteleul Palace, which has been built by Emperor Haile Selassie and became, in the 30s, the place of the Italian colonial government, where the attack, the tentative assassination of Graziani took place. Then it was again the Emperor Palace, and then became the home of the ethnological museums. Next, some of these museums are presently in a restoration process. The buildings are in a restoration process in Kampala, but also in Addis Ababa. It's important to say that the Ethiopian government asked to the Italian government to support the restoration of this historical palace, and Italy will restore the palace. It will be an occasion also to rethink the narration, the museum discourse. So hopefully this restoration will help the African personnel together with us to change a bit the narration. Next. So, which are the aims of this project? The most important objective of the project is exactly to strengthen partnership between African museums and Italian museums preserving African heritage, because we strongly believe that the partnership will benefit both African and Italian museums, promoting dialogue, mutual collaboration, and help our 8 museums to overcome some of the needs and the issues that all our museums are currently facing. So you can see, I will say something. Digitalization is at the core of the project. So the idea is to select a part of this huge heritage, digitalize it, and put on a common platform, sharing metadata and also images under the principle of transparency, assess conservative issue, carry out research on provenance, carry out research in the fieldwork among the source communities, work with artists and with communities, engaging them in the museum programs, produce some temporary exhibition, and hopefully improve museum management and financial sustainability, even through some university modules organized with the support of the project in the connected universities. Next. So, which kind of heritage we are working on? It is only ethnographic and artistic collections, both in Italy and in the 3 African countries. We have chosen the African countries because of the presence of objects from the same nations in Italian collection. So we are dealing with 37,000 approximately items from the 4 African museums and around 6,000 objects in the Italian museums, mainly coming from the Horn of Africa for historical reasons, Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, but also from Uganda and Democratic Republic of Congo. I would like to underline the fact that in Italian museums, in Italian collections, we have a huge amount of objects from Congo, from the present Democratic Republic of Congo, because of the massive participation of Italians in the colonization of Congo under Leopold II and even after the Belgian colony. And this resulted in thousands and thousands of objects from Congo. So we need to study this heritage together with the help of our African colleagues. Next. So how? Because of course, it is very nice to say that we need to collaborate, we need to share, but then concretely, it's not so easy to share information on objects under the principle of transparency. So concretely, we will select a certain number, some thousand of objects from this huge corpus, and we will fully digitalize them creating some digital laboratories in the 3 African countries and training museum personnel and students in doing this operation, and then share the metadata resulting from the research we will carry out and the digitalized object, the digital twins of the object on a platform. Of course, this poses a lot of questions, a lot of problems. We need to choose languages to be used, probably English and French. We need to choose a language that help us in translate and also guarantee the interoperability of the system. And we need to standardize the vocabulary in use, reaching a common language. But at the same time, we are very much aware that the local terms must be recorded together with the indigenous knowledge. So I think this is one of the most difficult challenges we have. But this goal, the digitalization, will grant the circulation of the knowledge in a transnational perspective. Next. Yes. We all know that the objects are in a big lack of information, both in Italy and in the African countries. So it is necessary to carry out research campaigns both in the archive and in the field. So on these selected objects, and this object will be selected upon their historical, cultural, and also aesthetic point of view, we will try to study in depth the biography of the objects from the production context through the various paths that led them into museums. So, moreover, assessing the acquisition of the objects is essential to clarify the legal status of the objects. In my experience, there are many different ways of acquisition. Purchase, maybe on an equal perspective, but purchase resulting also from scientific expedition or diplomatic gift, as you see, but also loot. As in Torino, in Piemonte, we have a lot of African objects, especially from Ethiopia, but not only, that have been looted. So these circumstances must be clarified under the principle of transparency and, on my view, put on the web. So everybody will be able to consider what possible action should be taken, and this is one of the main objectives of the SIME project. Next. But we also need to go back to the villages, to the source communities, and do fieldwork research. And this is very important for ethnographic objects, because we know that most ethnographic items belong to living systems of practices, subsistence activities, food, entertainment, rituals, religious performance, etc. So healing practices, we need to collect the information on the original meaning and function of the object, but we need also to collect multimedia, audiovisual materials that can be used for documentation, but also for the display in the museums, so to try, at least in this way, to bring back object to life. It is a living heritage, it has been said. Now, with technology, we have a lot of different means to restitute life to the musealized objects. Next. But also, as it has been said, engagement with communities is very important, both among the source communities, but also among the diasporic communities in Italy. So the project will try to promote the engagement of communities, so to create initiatives able to display and disseminate the knowledge related to the cultures represented in museums. But I would like to add something, because today we spoke a lot about identities, communities. I would like also to underline that the national museums, as the one we are dealing with, they normally display side by side objects coming from different contexts, from different communities, and in this way they highlight the extraordinary cultural and aesthetic value of objects that can be appreciated beyond the borders of their own society. And this, I think, is also another aspect of the story. Museums can promote diversity. So it is, in my view, it was very interesting this morning to listen to Alain Godonou when he was speaking about the law, the Benin law promulgating a national collection. I think that we should also remember the lesson of James Clifford, the museum as a contact zone, coming from Marie-Louise Pratt's notion, a museum that is not only a representation of single identities, but can promote dialogue and communication among different cultures, including European cultures. So I think that this is another important aspect. So I think you can go on with the slides. You can show the slide. These are some samples of the objects we are dealing with, and I just wanted to leave you some visual impression of what is the heritage on which we are working on. That's the last one. Thank you.
I know, I think everyone is a bit tired. Maybe I can tell you, I had 3 keywords: conservation. What kind of conservation do we want? And do we all want the same? Not sure. Money, who's paying for what? Where is the money coming from? For whose benefit? And also, how can we talk about dialogue in such an unbalanced economic disparity, because it's still the case, and politics. What are the political agendas? Because I think everyone in this room knows that there are political agendas, and also that some people are benefiting way more than others. And here I mean the elite, the museum people, us, the academics, we benefit from all of this, but who else? So that was my ideas. Do you want to react on that, or should we take the question of the audience first, and then okay, so maybe we will do that. Please, Daniele. Maybe we will, just to get you a bit excited, we will take the question first from you, and if there is still time, we can address money, politics, conservation, because it's a bit unsaid, although it's very major. We will take the question 2 by 2. We thought maybe it's a bit more dynamic. So who's in charge of the mic? Is somebody? Okay, you are. So just, is there any questions? Yes. Okay, so we have the first, I think the first 2 are there, and then it's Jean-Paul.
What is again? Okay. J'essaie de poser ma question en français parce que la question concerne messieurs.
My question concerns Monsieur Mumbele. When I heard your speech, you talked about the museum as a place for exchange, and I thought of the library as a counter model to use. And so the idea of authenticity in favor of Africa and the African museums. While thinking of Mediatek for African museums in Europe. I don't know if you've ever considered similar models for you. Maybe the library, the Mediatek could be models. There was a moment when the International Office for Museums had thought about them for European collections. It was a great step to create copies to disseminate art. Presence is not necessary. We have internet. We can even look at 3D objects thanks to the internet. Even a copy, if you want. We have exhibited copies from World War II just to avoid issues with laws, legal frameworks. The question I would ask instead goes beyond the materiality, which is quite complicated for museums. We had a very complicated case in Turin, and I think my colleague will remember about it. It was a case in which we had to define the shape of the head, and we talked about scientific error back then. What I think is that I'm a little bit in the middle between the ambassador objects and the objects that need to be given back. Because on the one hand, we have the question I will have to ask everybody. Objects that are stocked can be moved with no problems. So in Val d'Aosta, for instance, we gave them back a specific work of art that the museum in Turin was basically storing, and therefore we decided to give this back to its original province. So I'm against the possessive spirit feeling that is typical of public staff, public authorities. Well, I understand the political reasons. Would you like to add anything else? It is true that the question is quite important. So the matter of authenticity of collections, I would like to give you an example, a very recent example, actually. In 2022, the King of Belgium, visiting the Republic of Congo, brought with him an object that was to be given back to the Republic of Congo. It was a symbolic gesture that was very strong from a cultural and political perspective. This single object was the only one that was proposed, and when we obtained it, when we received it, we had to face important internal issues because for local population, this object was fake, was not authentic. And therefore, they were assuming that Belgium had exchanged the original one with the fake object. So when it comes to restitution, local communities want and really value the authenticity. That specific object was used in particular ceremonies. Well, so maybe we could keep the fake ones in Europe and give the original ones back to Africa. Well, we think that Belgium gave us a fake asset because it was not in the condition of giving us the original one. I had the opportunity of working on this activity. I participated in the debate on this object. And an article was published on this lack of trust, basically. So with restitution, we also have to work on trust in order to properly achieve an effective restitution of the cultural heritage. So we can give back important and many objects, but sometimes local communities are skeptical. They are not sure about the authenticity of the goods we receive. I agree with you. In my opinion, cultural items need to circulate both ways. So African objects need to travel to Europe, and European objects should travel towards Africa. So a fair exchange, basically, this would facilitate the inclusion of art and the opening of arts to all people. I think there is another question.
The question is on the digitalization. I'm very curious about it. Number one, who will manage the digital platform you're talking about? Will it be a build and transfer model? And two, where will the servers reside for the digitalization process?
Thank you. Of course, it's a very complex process. We just started, so we have not yet selected the society who will do this big job. What I can say is that we are going to organize a legal committee, a committee of legal experts from the 4 countries in order to write and sign a protocol controlling the process of digitalization. As far as I understood, in the 3 African countries where we are working, digitalization is still quite new. So there are not so many guidelines under a governmental point of view, and this make the whole process quite complex. So the project has, among one of the results, the guidelines, legal, especially a legal framework of guidelines for the management of the platform. Initially, the platform will be an experimental product probably managed by the University of Torino, but of course the 8 museums they will keep the ownership not only of the images, but on the right of disseminating the information, and is something that we will need to discuss. There will be different level of accessibility of the information, and it will be up to the museum, the owners of the object, to decide how to do. In Ethiopia, we started with some colleagues from the University of Addis Ababa, some from the law department, to study the thing, and we realized that there is something quite new, so it will need a lot of reflections, I think. That's what I can say at the moment, because it's the fourth month of the project, so we are at the beginning of this task. Yeah. Sorry? Yes.
The ownership.
The ownership, of course, will remain in the museum which own the object, so they have the right of the images and of the metadata. My personal view is that the more transparency we will reach, the best result we will have, but of course it will be in the museum's will to decide the level of accessibility. And I realize that it will need a lot of discussion.
Yeah, just go ahead and then, okay, Jean-Paul.
Yeah.
Elle a dit que la sienne, elle était liée. Peut-être on prend la sienne et après, sorry about that, Jean-Paul. Pardon.
Merci. I'm Eva, and I'm from the University of Cambridge. And my question is, since you're in the early stages, whether you're reading and engaging with any African literature about digitization of material culture and how that's influencing how you're developing the project.
For us, the main model, it's a project that you might know, Digital Benin, which was developed by a museum in Germany, and a very, very interesting platform, but quite different from what we are doing because it's exclusively belonging to one group. So, but they adopted some interesting policies about the legal management of the information and on the images. Ethiopia is launching a new policies on digitalization in these last days, but it is a general process regarding public administration, so it's not focusing on museum. Of course, we will get some information from there. Uganda and Congo, I don't know. I would like to know if there are experts there working on this, because we really need to have somebody in our committee, but I don't know yet.
Jean-Paul. I think Jean-Paul wanted to speak. Non, mais vas-y, Jean-Paul, t'as le micro, là.
D'accord, merci.
Grazie. Io vorrei intervenire. I would like to talk about 3 specific points. First of all, I would like to inform the Assembly, Placide Mumbele in particular, that many things are being done at the ICOM level to support the areas that are facing crisis. The deputy chairman of ICOM, who is here with us, will confirm that ICOM has already published a declaration for peace all over the world. For what concerns ECOM Africa, we have prepared recommendations to support countries that are facing crisis, not only in Africa, and to support the protection of cultural heritage in these areas. Therefore, we hope that all the people here will participate in these initiatives and will join these recommendations prepared by ICOM. We are closely following the situation of protecting assets due to from the war consequences. For what concerns museums, we have been talking about this aspect for several years. It's one of the main aspects within ICOM, and we would like to speak about it even more. Many people say that, many people argue about different solutions, but in my opinion, it is important to finally get to a concrete conclusion. I would like to answer what is being said. What has been said? My friend Didier said what needs to be done by museums, by professionals of the global south, but there is an aspect I would like to reiterate. The corporations and the group of professionals need to take action. But what do they need to do to decolonize the spirit beyond the institutions? I think that this new mindset will have to be real and concrete. Professionals can commit to define new relationships. We can really work concretely to achieve concrete results at an equal level. And therefore, I would also like to talk about some specific questions. I'm really disappointed by some choices that have been made. Sometimes we are skeptical. We avoid talking about specific subjects, and therefore I would like to talk about restitution. That is quite a dark phase. Human remains, for example, are being stored in boxes, and I think this is unacceptable, and therefore professionals working in museums all over the world have to work to avoid this situation, because people are not objects. And it is mandatory for these human remains to be given back to the countries where they come from. And I think professionals all over the world should raise their voice to reiterate the importance of restitution in this case, because in the African soul, in the African culture, you will never be peaceful until you are properly buried. And therefore, we want peace, we want agreement, and we should start, in my opinion, from these little steps. All professionals should raise their voice to say that starting from now, all human remains that are stored in the museums must go back to their original countries, because they cannot be considered as objects. And this is the only way to move from words to actions. And this is what we need right now. And also, I would like to remind you that on the 27th of November 2017, when Macron, the president of France, gave his opinion, professionals laughed. Is it possible, in your opinion? I think that the problem of provenance is relevant. For 5 years now, we have talked about provenance. We need to search the provenance of these objects. We need to find an approach to adopt. So yes, we have items that need to be given back, but sometimes if we have no sufficient knowledge, we have to study and work hard to find them, find the information we are not familiar with. In order to find and to do so, it is necessary to act together with a pragmatic approach. Now, let me conclude by focusing about communication. I think that communication hasn't been taken into consideration. I think that some objects of my childhood that have been discarded, and I think that in several museums we should have museums for old objects. I think many museums want to comply with the international standards. Think about the British Museum. If you look for these objects in houses, this activity becomes quite complex. So, in my opinion, what we need to say is that we have a lack of affection with these objects, and we need to avoid this. We need to avoid, we need to prevent this from becoming an intellectual fact only. Thank you. Have you got an answer? Well, let me add something. It's a very sensitive, quite delicate question. There are museums that I manage where we search for information, and today we can say that one of the most important relationship we have now is the one with Namibia. Why so? Many populations from Namibia do not want to transport these goods in boxes. And therefore, the objective is to prepare specific rooms to host these items. In this manner, they will basically become the basins for these objects, basically. And we have to work in order for these spaces to become entertaining areas dedicated to external population. Especially when we talk about human remains, these cannot be considered as objects. It's a big problem we have to deal with. It's a problem that needs important financial resources to be solved. It's also linked with the capacity, it's also linked to the capacity of people working in these fields, especially at an African level. And for this reason, we generally hire experts, professionals. There have been misunderstandings as some experts believed they could become cultural mediators for our museums in Namibia, but each country has its own history. I'm African, and therefore I can understand what you have just said. I'm aware of what communities live and experience on a daily basis. We have the problem of knowledge and capacity. But for what concerns provenance, we should collect all the means available in the regions. It's something very easy, something we need for Western collections in order to identify the provenance of the items that belong to the community. We did it with the museum in Toulouse, and it worked. But another problem we have to deal with is relevant to the movement, the transfer of objects. Because it's a very complex aspect. When I requested my visa, applied for my visa, I taught for a year, and my university had to take action for me to obtain the visa. Why am I saying this? Because I want to emphasize the problems, the diplomatic problems that do exist. And I think the colonialism hasn't been overcome. It has consequences on the relationships, and we have to keep this in mind without forgetting it.
Je crois que Placide voulait encore ajouter un mot.
Oui, c'est la question.
Vorrei parlare appunto I would like to talk about provenance and the restitution. As you all know, provenance is not an issue. Museums have worked hard on these aspects, but for what concerns Congo and Belgium case that we saw earlier today, many objects have been documented. Therefore, we already know which context these items belonged to. If they were the results of violence, they were basically categorized. So we studied the objects, and we have all the information available in some cases. So we work on these aspects, and we know we want all of these studies to be subject to this activity, because we want to know the origin of the items in the heritage. The museum in Evren has an inventory, digital inventory of 4 million objects. 86,000 have been recognized. But if we have to study each single object, we will have to work for 6 months relentlessly on a single object to determine its provenance. But this would be quite impossible. Each item needs deep research. Each item entails communication between the two museums, and this time frame is due to the failure to proper communicate. And in other cases, in a very short period of time, we managed to raise awareness and to have museums take their responsibility. We cannot have museums that act like our politicians, because they have to behave based on ethics. Therefore, these meetings, these conferences should help us go beyond the ethics code and should enable us to facilitate and streamline the process, the entire process.
I'm from Zambia and also representing ICOM here. I want to start by just making a comment, or rather just re-emphasizing what my brother Jean-Paul talked about when he talked about human remains. I just want to just state that for Africans, when they see their ancestors being kept and not treated fairly in spaces which are not their homes, it is very touching and emotional for them. And this is just an appeal to colleagues that have these remains to treat them with the respect that they deserve. For an African to have an ancestor not back home, they say his soul or her soul is not resting in peace. And at times they will say, we are not the way we want to be because one of us is not here. So it is such passion and such a sentimental attachment that we have to the human remains that are outside. So I just wanted to state it as an African, so that we see how and understand why Africans become very emotional when we talk about aspects of human remains. Now, back from my African hat to ICOM hat, and back to this conference. First of all, I would like to say thank you to ICOM Europe and all the partners that have organized this conference. And I think day one has really been great. We have gotten great presentations. And also thank you for the many good presentations that you have made. And I wanted to just state to Cecilia, just a comment, just for thought, not a question, regarding the digitalization of collections. And I think some African colleagues have raised this issue. One thing to just always keep at the back of the mind, whilst we are in a digital world where everything is going digital, not all regions around the world are the same and have the same facilities. You have to think through what kind of support will be given the other side. Otherwise, you will do this nice platform, but it will only serve one side of the world. And the other partners, it will not be important for them, and they remain in the dark regarding what has been done. So it's one thing to think about. And then coming back to my two brothers here, Didier and Placide, you mentioned, both of you, in your presentation, and Jean-Paul at some point talked about this issue of repatriation, restitution is not a story that was started when somebody said we're going to return, but it's a thing that we've been talking more than half a century regarding the return of whether cultural property or cultural goods or human remains or whatever we want to call them from the various epistemologies of museums that we come from as professionals. But time and again, people have hit a dead end, and very few success stories have been there. The Benin one or the Benin bronzes that returned, but there's so much that is still out there. There are challenges that are there, and these challenges have not been overcome. We all are talking here, and many times we'll say we need to have respective dialogue, we need to engage each other. We say all these things, but at the end of the day, very little progress is being done. And now I have a question for both of you. We're here and we're in the space of ICOM, we have a platform, we can talk about this. And my question is, what would you say an institution such as ICOM, how can ICOM play a role in this, in facilitating this kind of dialogue that will become fruitful to us achieving what we would like to do? And actually, ICOM, I must state, you probably know, we created a working group on decolonization so that ICOM can rethink how it must decolonize and how it can play a role to help institutions, museums, deal with issues of decolonization. And we have a working group, and the chair actually is right next to me, and some of you have already met Hannah Pennock. But what can ICOM do in this particular situation is my question. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Teddy, for your comment. Thank you for your question. I think this is the reason why we're here. As things stand, as I had already said, we have the feeling that ICOM has prepared the ground for exchanges, restitution at a political level, and I think this has facilitated the interaction, but I think people believe the most important aspect is political. I think that ICOM should raise further awareness on the importance of the communication between the global south and the global north. So they should create a platform where people could dialogue, because museums as structures, facilities, would allow researchers and professionals from the South to work directly on the collections that are located in some specific museums. In doing so, we would facilitate the success of his or her research. So this would create connections, and at that time, they could suggest a way to give these items back to the country where they belong. We have bill of laws, sometimes laws that have already been voted, that are very strict. If you look at the Belgian one, for instance, the law is quite strict, but it's actually closed. It doesn't give the real possibility of actions. They say that the restitution needs to take place from a country between two countries, and that recognition has to be done by specific communities. I'll give you an example. In our museum, we have an item that was taken from the central of Congo, and the community stated that these items couldn't be produced because the lack of this tool basically prevented them from accessing specific activities, even farming. So this was a specific request made by communities. They requested the restitution of this item in writing, and they justified their request. So it was an official request, but they have to wait. They have to wait for the National Commission, which could even reject their request. So we have to work between museums. We have to interact and cooperate, because I think that with the cooperation, we could all have the benefits we deserve. we could put in researchers, experts in contact in order to facilitate and streamline logistics. So this is my perspective. I would like to say that if we look at restitution, as you said, Thierry, politicians have enabled restitution. Researchers, professionals have contributed. But first of all, politicians made it possible. Otherwise, we couldn't have done it. So politics and politicians walked in the museums, got in touch with researchers, and facilitated restitution. I think that Africa has become powerful, and even African politics has become powerful. Before we talked about awareness, which is necessary. And in our continent, Africa, we need to be strong, powerful. We have a specific African culture in Benin where many museums exist. But I think we should have acted in advance to understand how these museums operated. Let's take a look at the American Museum that you talked about, the museum that focused on National Socialism. So we can say that in many parts of Africa, people give importance to political decisions, but in my opinion, Africa should become powerful enough to operate independently. It has a great potential, and I think this could become extremely important. Going back to the question on restitution, we have talked about an ancestor that was buried outside its community and that couldn't be properly buried. It's important to give value to these human remains, and I think there should be dedicated spaces named after the museum itself with specific memorials where people could go and where researchers can analyze the DNA to understand the identity of this human being. I'm part of ICOM Europe, and I would like to go back to ICOM Europe. I think it would be very nice to have discussions focusing on this topic. As Jean-Paul was saying, this is a very important aspect. Human remains do exist. In Japan, for instance, there were loots. And I think that for the ICOM heritage, it is important to have all the information available. On the lack of progress, I think that professionals from museums should turn into politicians, because we have to take action and work closely with the politicians. I think that politicians and museum staff are never the same, because bureaucracy is always very long. In some cases, these so we had to deal with several issues that slowed the process down, especially from a political perspective. The same applied to Germany. There's another collection in the Netherlands that stopped due to the lack of financing. So there are obstacles in Europe that have jeopardized the finalization of some activities. Therefore, I think that the responsibility of the professionals and ICOM, even at a local level, is to deal with this aspect and to constantly talk about it, even with politicians. So local, regional committees need to put pressure on the politics. They should urge politicians to finally take action. I think that at a national level, action is important. At an international level, we have teamwork, we have guidelines, but I think the first vital step is local, because otherwise we would have no practical tools to implement the guidelines. So in my opinion, we should keep talking about this problem. Unfortunately, the main problem is linked to financing, and projects sometimes fail regardless of the commitment of professionals. Sometimes it is impossible to finalize the restitution of assets because of the lack of financing, at least for the Belgian. We need another question. We have time for another question, and then we'll move on to the other.
I would like to underline that the action I mentioned of the European Union, the initiative the European Union will finance €1 million at the start for France, Germany, and Netherlands and Belgium. Also, the Italian side is financed. So I think that ICOM could play an important role in the management of these projects. I also think that Alain Goudinot, that is in the committee, and I think that we can appeal so that the African museums answers for an intra-museum cooperation between Europe and Africa. So we would like to work on the cooperation side. And if the result will be the restitution, that will be perfect. But for me, it is important to create a collaboration level between the museums, as you have just said, because I think that European Union could be useful. I just wanted to underline this point. I think that we have to pay attention to this in the few months. I think that ICOM has two ways of act. Knowing how to talk, for example, we made some recommendations. But every time there is a problem, ICOM is the main character, or tries to be. And the second point is that I do not know what means. I do not know what means speaking directly. But I think it is to act directly, that is organizing conferences. It is not useful to organize conferences without peer-to-peer relationships or group relations. Every European country, and we are the last European country. Italy was one of the first countries in Libya. So it is important to adopt and to act in collaboration with national committees. They have to be present to help the museums in order to find direct contacts. We know that history is slow and we desire things, but it takes time, centuries. Maybe we will not be able to see the results of the act we are going to take now, but it's important to create some networks, and this is the basis of our mission. Some networks are still working, and this is the reality. That is what ICOM must do, a network of professionals that work together and collaborate. Networks and resistance, I think that are key words. Thank you for having participated. Thank you.